Our coalition of organizations between the NAACP and Sonoma County Black Forum were in communications with the county to unpack where the data was. We unfortunately were not able to locate adequate data to help us understand what the lived experiences were of Black residents in Sonoma County, because unfortunately in past years, due to the smaller population size deemed statistically insignificant, we were not included in the Portrait of Sonoma's counting. And so we worked closely together to attend all of the informational meetings to ensure that we were not left out, to better help us make informed decisions around how we could pursue both gathering data and understanding what types of potential programs and initiatives we could bring back forward into community. So a little background on what the Portrait of Sonoma is. The Portrait of Sonoma captures, based on a number of qualifiers, overall healthy human development index, which is around your quality of life, life expectancy overall, educational attainment and accessibility, and of course, cost of living and whether you are living a livable wage. Based on this map you see, that was the highlight and sort of really glorified sharing of what came out of the 2021 update as a result of the 2020 census tract and other data collection entities, highlighting the different HDI index scores throughout Sonoma County. So in areas here where it's relatively high, 6.7 and above, and in the 3s and in the 4s down below. From 2014, this was the outcome of the data that was reported, and then the recommendations that came out of what's called the Agenda for Action. That entity has shifted into its own organization called Health Action. More we'll share on that towards the end of the presentation, but essentially wanting to highlight the findings that came out of the 2014 report, which I want to note did not include Black or Indigenous residents, noting that healthy and long life, and what were the efforts for anti-smoking. So as you know, the Sonoma County Tobacco Coalition has worked really hard to try and mitigate the use of vaping and electronic pens and flavor that has moved through legislation. Access to knowledge, which is the access to universal preschool, which we've seen through many of the programs offered by 4Cs, CAP Sonoma, and oh gosh, there's a third one that's escaping my brain. And making sure that there is an effort put into place to address the graduation rates and, of course, mitigating the youth disconnection that was happening at a rampant pace, and of course, minimum wage increase. Recommendation around data highlighted at the time was about $14. We're now seeing those increases coming through both at the county and city levels and an upwards of $15 to $20, depending on the organization and entity. And so here are the areas that create the Human Development Index score. This is the 3 dimensions of healthy long life, access to knowledge, a decent standard of living, all connected through physical safety, political participation, having a sustainable environment, respect of others, digital access, having capacity for self-expression, religious freedom, equality in the law, voice and autonomy, family and community identified, pulled together through life expectancy at birth, educational degree attainment, school enrollment and earnings, pulling together the score that we've seen. And so participating in those sessions, I can personally say, I was like, okay, this all makes sense. This should tell us something really, really insightful about what's happening in community. And boy, did we learn. The levels of human development score for Black community measured for the first time in this data set were at 3.99 compared to peer affinity groups. And this was relatively low compared to other racial ethnicities in Sonoma County. And although there was a report done here in 2014, it did not have a data mark for Black residents, but some earlier data captured in the 2012 census suggests that the rate was somewhere around 4.27. But that's what we have to go with based on what was provided. And so it really highlighted some really key alarms for some of the most marginalized demographics here in our community. And so we deemed it a state of an emergency because it highlighted some of the largest gaps in systems and access impacting Black community members. The overall HDI score decreased from the 4.68 to 3.99, which is still far below the state average at 5.85 and the national average at 5.33, resulting in an overall lifespan decline 10 years shorter than any other racial or ethnic group here in Sonoma County. And so there's a huge gap between the overall life expectancy of Black and Latino identified residents. The housing burden, which we know has some of the greatest impact on community to date, but renters making up now at this point, I believe the last data point we got was closer to about 71%. And now with the recent homeless count, it's at 13%, up from 6%. And the indigenous population, I believe, is at nearly 16. I could be wrong, but it's higher than the Black population at this point. And we're continuing to see the manifestation of the under-enrollment in schools at the time of the portrait being released, being at 69.3%, and Black youth having some of the lowest educational attainment rates across the county as an average. And this for us was alarming, disturbing, and really put a fire under the table to recognize there are some huge disparities. Of course, all things cannot be tackled at once, but more importantly, to really help us understand the pathways that could be developed forward in order to address some of these earlier disparities that were presented. And so now that we look 2 years later, we have been in conversation with our community partners to really understand how, before fully being assessed, what are some of the ways that we've tried to tackle some of these disparities. And so earlier on, we identified a few key community partners that were able to, that had the capacity to support some of these initiatives moving forward. We had been working all along, and really through the leadership of our second Vice President, Demetra Smith, with a partnership on the Bay Area Regional Health Inequities Initiative, affectionately known as BARHI, and really worked to understand not just the housing issues in Sonoma County, but as a region, some of the patterns and migration that was taking place across the greater Bay Area's 9 counties. The big movement of Black families transitioning out of historical neighborhoods in San Francisco and in Oakland, San Mateo, East Palo Alto, Richmond, Vallejo, transitioning out to Antioch, Oakley, and communities that are, far 2 to 3 hours of a commute time to get to work if they kept their same employment, and of course, to continue to access affordable housing, and really helped us build out a network of housing experts that we were able to lean into and to understand the opportunities to really begin to unpack the path forward with housing. But as we know now with the interest rates and the costs, we definitely quickly were priced out of even imagining what the potential could be, because we know wholeheartedly funding for a program to address housing for Black residents in Sonoma County would need to be in an extreme surplus, and those opportunities were not presenting themselves as we were in continued conversations with financial institutions and our elected officials. We also then maintained partnership with Sonoma County Black Forum, and were able to, through the ARPA process, which were the dollars allocated through the American Rescue Act, able to launch 2 programs, one for financial assistance to serve up to about 230 folks, $800 for rapid assistance or $1,200 for rent. I can tell you with that program launching in November, a wait list had to begin in February because the funds had already been, I guess you would say, pre-slated to run out with the amount of applications that were received in that 3.5-month timeframe. And so are operating a waiting list to better understand with the county's resources if additional dollars could be put into play to support the rapid needs that folks have. And then the therapy program is set up to serve 234 community members. And this is anyone looking for culturally responsive, culturally competent therapy. A network of about 41 practitioners were pulled together throughout the Greater Bay Area, identifying across many of the demographic spectrums related to race, educational backgrounds, language access, and gender-based identities, and really been able to provide us with just a wealth of knowledge on, culturally competent therapy and resources, which has been, given the feedback from some of our participants and our youth, a really fresh breath of access to additional resources, as we know that therapists of color are very limited in Sonoma County. And then, of course, because we know that we don't get these outcomes of data just by surprise. These are years and historical practices and patterns and systems that have been put into place, are in the works of waiting for an additional approval through the institution, but in partnership with a professor and students at Sonoma State, prepared to launch a slavery historical research project through all access libraries, county records, and all interested parties on board. And students will take this on and lead it forward and help us best understand some of the more intrinsic pieces of the history of Sonoma County and Black residents' lived experience, to, again, put together and help us best recognize those things. And of course, you're maybe wondering what's still missing in order for some of the other disparities to be addressed. Long-term funding is definitely one of the key areas. It has been quite an eye-opening experience to, take several meetings with a number of our elected officials, county and city representatives, respectively, across the 9 government entities, and experience folks still really sitting with their discomfort as the priority, instead of really being able to join in and think creatively about where to find the dollars to invest in not just these programs, but the existing programs to bring them to ensure they're accessible to Black residents and to ensure that they are able to reach people in community. And that's one of the pieces that is definitely high on our radar and list to continue to pursue, so that there is an investment beyond just the American Rescue Plan Act dollars that are time limited, to ensure that access to culturally competent therapy doesn't end in 2026. That rapid financial assistance programs are not only available just after disaster or hazard, but on an ongoing basis. And then further analysis, as you would imagine, on how to ensure that more programs and resources that are available in our community are funneled into some of these more vulnerable populations that may not have as much access to these things. And so now that the portrait's released, we have these programs, we know the dollars are needed to continue to prioritize. The last bit is this key shift that'll come through the agenda for action, which will now be spearhead through Health Action, which has now become its own nonprofit entity instead of a division under the county. The interesting piece with this is the analysis of the Portrait of Sonoma data, I believe, is slated to continue to offer opportunity for community input and feedback to allow for this plan to be a bit more thorough and a bit more inclusive, to allow for some of these things to hopefully be funded and or moved through into ownership through some of our government entities to get behind and ensure that they continue to be successful and to continue to be viable. Lindsay, did I miss anything on covering how that will work?
You nailed it. So essentially, Health Action Together is the new nonprofit that came out of the like unmerging with the county. And so they have now been able to staff themselves so that they are well enough resourced to be able to start in this community engagement process. We learned very much through the Portrait of Sonoma that, again, the data on our most marginalized and historically excluded populations were not thoroughly talked to, brought in, collaborated with. So the aim of this nonprofit is to do just that with people who are local community members who have a better idea of what's going on for us and what we need. And so they'll be able to give more time to having those community conversations, gather more local data. And again, we're hoping that that information will bolster up the type of support that Kirsten showed that was needed in the what's needed list. So more to come. Office of Equity will be presenting in a couple of months, and so their staff can share more on what that will look like in real time.
So we wanted to bring this forward to you all today, just because I know it sometimes we speak of in a bit of an abstract or in sometimes very limited capacity in other spaces, but to really demonstrate and model for everyone the ways in which, you know, this data was not only striking, but our commitment to continue action in pursuit of programmatic support, and more importantly, the advocacy that is not only needed just from our executive committee members, but from our entire membership to help us push this forward now that we understand how Health Action Together is going to move forward, to really allow for us, and we'll come up, as we've shared before, when we have a ongoing action, the talking points that'll be needed at respective meetings to ensure that we are pushing these endeavors forward. And more importantly, so that we don't get left behind for another 10 years of program development and funding, as we know the needs and the gaps, unless addressed fully, will continue to create that divide.